Welcome to the first quarter's iQuanti quarterly report. It's a quarterly report that we do, which essentially looks at all the trends in the industry in performance marketing, both performance marketing platforms, as well as a focus on banking and financial services. So really for us as marketers in like financial services to know what is going on across the whole industry, both from a platform as well as an industry perspective. Again, we do this every quarter. And if you guys want to kind of look at past quarters, you're welcome to reach out and we'll be glad to share those with you. So this has been a very interesting quarter, primarily because one, we had like several quarters have been up and up. Like everything has been going, everything has been great. And now suddenly in first quarter, we see some slowdown, and we will talk about the impacts of that. We also see obviously what we're living through today in second quarter just accelerated. So obviously there are like several impacts to the whole thing. But let's kind of get into what are some of the 9 key trends that we actually see. The first trend, of course, as I talked about, is the year-on-year revenue growth has been very flattening at this point. So Google search business still grew at a healthy 24%, YouTube at 15%, Facebook at like 7%, Twitter at 16%. Now, of course, if this still looks high, just to kind of look at just one quarter before, Google was at like 36%, YouTube was at like 25%, Facebook was at like 21%. So they're all like much higher percentages of growth. And if you just go back to a few quarters back, if you look at like Q2 of like 2021, YouTube was at a whopping 85%. Like Google search business was growing at 68%. So clearly you see like within a few quarters, there's been a fairly like dramatic slowdown that you kind of see. So that's, I think, one major trend, and most probably we'll see that kind of accelerate. And we are seeing that again in terms of the overall market. Of course, we are seeing many of these tech platforms like stopping hiring and some of those things that you're kind of seeing now. The next big trend that we kind of see, again, search remains strong at a 24% growth, even though YouTube, as we has kind of slowed down. So I think both, if you look at like organic as well as paid search, there have been like several impacts. Let's talk about paid search. So with paid search, Google's focus has been Performance Max, which uses like AI ML to actually look at your performance across various platforms that they have, right? Could be YouTube, could be like, could obviously be search, and looking at it, everything, figuring out how to allocate your budget to maximize your performance. So pretty much the machine takes care of everything once it kind of gets the learning up. So those pilots seem to be going well, and that could obviously be, it's a huge impact on marketers, right? So that's a big one that kind of one is looking at. From a just search ads itself, I think they'll just continue to stick to responsive search ads and kind of get out of any other forms of extension. So that's what's going on there. From a perspective of organic search, of course, now there, we talked about the MUM model last time. And for those of you who did kind of follow last time, it's like multitask unified model. It's an AI model that essentially looks across like multiple formats and kind of gives, you could be searching for something. It helps you search across multiple formats, uses AI heavily to help you figure out what is it that you really need on the formats that you need it. Now they're even combining it with like things like Google Lens, so that in the midst of a video, you could say, hey, these are the shoes I really like. Where can I get them from? And you could, so you're talking about both combining search with both, and in this case, it would be image search, right? In some ways, taking an image and searching what is similar across. So it is search across formats, and your input also could be like a different format, right? So it's really integrating this MUM search technology with kind of other forms. So really, I think we are seeing advances here, and we'll continue to see strong advances in search across various formats, across various devices. So in some ways, even with device continuity, I think they're talking about like Pixel, for example, being used to manage your YouTube channel and things like that. So you're seeing a lot of integration kind of there. So that's the second big trend. The third thing I think is obviously, I think privacy, and that's been a big thing that we've been talking about. Now, Google, of course, was kind of two things here. One, Google, the analytics piece itself, where Google is sunsetting their universal analytics platform. So that's, of course, a big one. And kind of rolling out GA4. GA4 has a bunch of advantages, but from privacy perspective, it's a privacy first platform. So obviously there is that impact there right there. And obviously it helps for like, it's a new standard solution for website and app tracking. So it uses machine learning to actually generate critical insights. So that's, again, definitely a big advance with analytics. From a from a privacy perspective, Google had kind of launched Flock several quarters back as an alternative that didn't seem to have gathered much traction. So the next, I guess, the next version or the next thing around it that Google has been kind of pushing is Topics. The Topics is interesting. It's essentially managing things at a browser level. So based on a fairly limited window, let's say 3-week window, what essentially what the browser will do is collect like a few top interests, not many, a few top interests of things that you're really interested in. And when let's say I go to a publisher site, the publisher gets the browser shares 3 top interests of mine based on this 3-week like interval you're talking about. And that should hopefully help with some degree of targeting, right? So that's kind of the whole idea. So fairly limited amount of information, fairly limited windows, and just collecting like 3 top interests and kind of going with it. We don't know what will happen. There still may be pushback. Obviously, there are browsers which are heavily focused on privacy, so like Firefox and others. And from an overall market share perspective, Chrome's market share is like mid 60s. So there's still a lot of other browsers that are being used, and they may not support. In which case, this is not going to take off. People may be worried that there may be like digital fingerprinting. So I could kind of go there. Obviously, give me 3 information, but I would still be free to collect a lot of information about the user. And so those could be kind of issues that people are dealing with. But yet, for marketers, I think Topics is an important step forward if it kind of takes off. And that's again thinking of how do you kind of market with like limited amount of information, like limited than what it is, but perhaps it'll also actually help clean up the situation and help us much better with kind of marketing. And let's talk about the 4th trend now, which is short form video, which has been an absolute tear, primarily led by TikTok. And TikTok continues to kind of lead over YouTube and others in terms of both user growth and engagement. But obviously, there's a lot of investment into these formats now that works. So a few things that have happened there. From a meta perspective, Instagram's entire focus is now on Reels. So Reels is really kind of where all the video investment is kind of going. YouTube is investing heavily into Shorts. They've just created a $100 million fund to support like publishers or to support actually content creators on Shorts. So that again kind of will help. Pinterest is kind of investing it has introduced Watch. So every social media platform is heavily obviously trying to capitalize on this. And the impact on marketers, I think, is twofold. One, of course, is advertising opportunities. And that quite still hasn't been figured out in terms of, because the user's ability or a desire to click through on videos in short form seems to be much lower than what you see in long form. So I think that's something that, obviously the platforms and the marketers need to figure out. But there's also some great work being done in terms of product placement and short form videos that's actually support the product. So there's a great creative opportunities for marketers here as well. So certainly a trend which is kind of going to have a big impact on digital marketing kind of as we know it. So those are the 4 trends that we see right now with what's happening with the platforms. Now let's talk about what's going on with banking and financial services. It's again been a very interesting quarter to kind of look at. One, of course, the digital engagement continues to grow. And that's been secular. In some ways, pandemic has kind of driven a huge growth of digital engagement, and that has just kind of continued. So, for example, if you look at Zelle, the online way by which people transfer money, Bank of America mentioned that it's actually overtaken checks. So now people digitally sending money going out of an account by Zelle is more than what's on checks, which is a big kind of landmark in some ways. Or if you look at digital sales last quarter, the same quarter, Q1 of 2021, was around, I think, 33%. It's 53% now. So you can see a big jump in digital sales. US Bank, more than 80% of the transactions are online transactions are online. So you can see broadly that a level of digital engagement that is going on. User growth with Erica, which is like Bank of America's, the digital kind of help agent. Again, a big growth driver. I think it's gone from 17 million to 12 million to 19 million to now 26 million. If you look at year-on-year growth over the last 2 years. So you see tremendous amount of digital engagement, and I think that is kind of here to stay. In some ways, digital from being one of the major channels is most probably, going to be the way that people interact with their banks and financial services. Now, as you look at what's happening in the market itself, right? So through the pandemic, what we've been seeing is obviously a great, sales has been really strong, and that continues. So people have been really spending money well on their credit card. So sales growth has been anywhere between 21 to 35% actually, growth based on which player. And then, of course, the balances haven't caught up though. So people have been still paying down, but again, they're climbing. So as we see, and especially now, I think in the bond race, especially with low credit quality folks, there seems to be some interest in ability to some impact on the ability to pay back. And so we will certainly start seeing, I think, even in other categories, we'll most probably start seeing balances kind of climb up. The other interesting thing is T&D travel. So T&D has now gradually kind of, it's started to come back up. The personal travel actually is more than where pre-pandemic than it was. So it has kind of grown. Corporate is still kind of much lower, and small businesses somewhere in between, still lower than pre-pandemic. But we can see T&D kind of clearly grow, and that's an interesting sign for banks. In terms of if there's a couple of players that stand out, right? I mean, so acquisition has been huge. I think Wells Fargo, with really strong value propositions and introduction of new products, has kind of grown really strongly in this category. Amex had a great quarter from an acquisition perspective. They reported acquiring around 3 million accounts, which is a record for them on a quarterly basis. So you see some outstanding performance there. In terms of deposits, again, similar trends as last time. Average deposits in large national banks, like the big ones, right? Chase, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, all have continued to grow very, very strongly in middle, 13 to 18% ranges. So they're all kind of growing strongly. The regional banks, the Fifth Thirds and large regional banks, right? The Fifth Thirds and others of the world, they are all at around 8-9%. They're in high single digits that you see. And then the digital banks are much lower at 2% and 3%. So that growth hasn't been seen. However, now as interests start climbing, I think people may see the value of having money in a digital bank, which actually pays you an interest, versus Chase or a Bank of America, where substantial amount of checking, accounts are all, of course, 0%. So I think there we might see a change in behavior, and to see digital banking start growing again. Look, there's no reason for a Chase or Bank of America and anyone who's sitting on tons of this zero interest money to start kind of raising rates on that, right? So that remains a cheap source of funding for them, and a great source to kind of make money as interest rates go up. So they lend at a much higher rate. But again, I think we might see digital banks kind of, scale up on deposits. From a loans perspective, a very challenging environment for mortgage, as you can make out. I think on two fronts. I think we saw refinance really kind of go down starting kind of even last quarter. Everyone who had to kind of do refinance and refinance, it was kind of really kind of coming down. And then I think now with the interest rates climbing very, very quickly, I think it's almost pretty much crashed. But the level of interest rates have now kind of climbed at a rate where you might even see an impact in home buying behavior. So I think it will be a very challenging environment for mortgages. I think from an auto perspective, I think demand things being what they are, still very strong growth in spite of having issues with supplies of autos. I think that kind of continues. Again, student and commercial loan balances again saw strong growth. Commercial loan balances, especially, I think the PPP hang is kind of done, and people are kind of trying to kind of make sure that they're secure and kind of securing strong balances and looking at growth there. I think one thing to kind of talk about, even in terms of loans, is of course one of the outstanding, one of the big performers on just loans. From a personal loans perspective, I think SoFi remains outstanding players, and they've grown, reported very strong growth, while others have kind of shown a very strong small growth. So I think one thing to kind of think about is an outstanding performer on the personal loans front has been SoFi. On the auto side, I think Capital One has done tremendously well, and it's a great example of how to use digitization, kind of use a platform in their partnerships with dealers, kind of really driving much stronger growth than everyone else, and I think increasing their market share in the space. So they think they've done really well in that space. In terms of investment and wealth management, I think The growth has continued in Q1. So people still adding a lot of accounts, like Schwab, I think grew by 1.2 million accounts. At the pre-pandemic, I think 800, 900 would have been considered a very good, quarter for them. So it's really, I think, still kind of people coming into the market. I think that has been happening in Q1. However, the balances overall for almost all players have declined because of the value of assets. And that, of course, in Q2 will be much more severe because we've seen much further decline of asset values. I think the other thing that we are starting to see, most probably, we will start to see, I think, is while that was at the tail end in Q1 of a cycle, I think in Q2, we might see some of these newbies also drop off because obviously the shock to the system in terms of the drops in valuations, whether it's in crypto or some other form of tech stock and other assets, have been fairly strong. So we might see that the overall sheer number of new folks who kind of come into the market, I think, if not go down, it will certainly slow down. That growth will slow down. It didn't happen in Q1, but we expect that will happen in Q2. But broadly, those are the trends that we kind of see. Again, a very interesting quarter. And I think really a change quarter between a strong growth in almost all the quarters of 2021 and now with 2022, as we kind of looking at trends kind of heading down. I think Q1 it certainly gives us a good signals of things to come as we see it. Again, this is iQuanti quarterly. If you guys want to look, we do it every quarter. So if you want to kind of go and look at the previous ones, please reach out to us. We'll be glad to kind of absolutely share them. Come to iQuanti.com and you can kind of download the iQuanti quarterly report, which has a lot more detail. And if there is certainly kind of more things to kind of reach out, feel free to kind of reach out to me at vish.sastry@iQuanti.com. Thank you. Bye.